Hey everybody, as folks are joining us, so we're just letting last couple people in from the waiting room, and we'll get started momentarily. If you don't mind, as you join, just muting yourself as we kind of start the presentation, and then we'll have a discussion section towards the end of the call.
Sarah, can I say something before we get going? Again, I'm not sure if it's at my end, but your words are getting cut off at the end, truncated. Does everyone else hear the same thing, or is it just me?
Is anyone else having?
Anybody?
Yeah, it seems fine. Might just be you.
It's fine
All
for
right.
me. I hear everything she says.
Dennis, you might want
All
to
right.
try logging off and logging back on.
Yeah, I'm going to do it again. Thank you.
Okay, so the flow of folks in the waiting room is starting to slow. We'll give Dennis a moment to sign off and sign back in, and then just in the interest of time, we'll get started. All right, I'm just waiting for Dennis to join in the waiting room, but Tim, do you want to kick things off, and I'll keep an eye on the waiting room for Dennis, just so that we make sure we stay on time?
Sure. Well, hey, great turnout. Thanks everyone for joining us today. I wanted to give just a little bit of background before I get started, though. I'm not a big icebreaker guy, and I don't want to take a lot of time with introductions. So what I was hoping we could do is just use the chat to introduce yourself, just add your name, title, where you're from into the chat, and people can use that to match up with your name on your Zoom. So we could do that. That would be great. And I'll get started then with what we're up to today. You want to go to the next slide, Sarah? So talk a little bit about sort of the background. I think this is largely my fault. I had started this idea and this concept at the RPC and talked about the idea of developing a regional resiliency program with our friends at the Coastal Program. Mostly because when I joined RPC about 5 years ago, I just observed a tremendous amount of work being done, in the efforts to address climate, sea level rise, storm impacts, and all the resiliency planning going along with that. I also noticed, and as I think a lot of you realize, there's a lot of groups in that arena. Everyone from UNH Cooperative Extension, other UNH researchers, PrEP has interest in this, SHAE, the Seabrook Hampton Estuary. Of course, the formation of CAW many years ago. It's just another group where people are coming together and talking about this. And then on the more local level, we're starting to see climate adaptation groups like the Hampton group known as CHAT. And then of course there's the RPC, and we're involved as well. Higher up the ladder, our federal partners and state partners working through the Coastal Program. Even the New Hampshire DOT is becoming more involved in active in coastal resilience planning, which is it's good. I mean, all of this is really great that we're all working together. But one of the observations I had is we have our coastal municipalities, and these municipalities are all members of the RPC, and I think what can happen when we have this many people and this many groups and this type of messaging that they're faced with these decisions to make on climate and sea level rise and how to be more resilient. They're hearing it from multiple organizations. The message is getting out there, but it isn't always coordinated, can be sometimes redundant, sometimes duplicative, despite our best efforts, which can be overwhelming for communities to manage and also lead to some confusion as to who to turn to for specific help on specific issues. So the idea behind this regional program was to at least help the coastal communities, for starters, try to take a more comprehensive approach to resilience planning, sustainability, try to make sure that we maybe have some common goals and can work on build on some of the good work that's already been done without necessarily duplicating the effort. So as I said, as far as the region is concerned, we started this conversation thinking simply the coastal program, the coastal zone, anyway, the coastal communities. But the reality of it is, at least from what I can see now, as I think about this, especially in light of the last 2 years, you can think of resiliency in a whole number of different ways. And I think honestly, a program where if we were to develop this and it were to grow, I think extending it into inland communities could actually benefit a lot of the coastal communities as well. Just anything from water quality or just to the economy of the region. I think that larger geography could have some great benefits. So that's sort of in a nutshell how we came to do this. I think what I want to do is let Sarah go through the framework that we have developed, and then I'm going to sort of circle back and talk a little bit about how, if we were to move this forward, how we might try to fund it.
Great. So as some of you know, we started thinking about and developing this program framework. We need a good acronym for it. We're still working on that. So I'm just going to call it the framework for today's presentation. But we started developing this framework back over the winter. I'd say, probably around the December timeline was when we really started to sort of think about how we wanted to approach this. And one of the first things that we did was starting to engage with both regional and kind of local organizations, as well as other communities that are dealing with, similar, mostly with a coastal focus, but, similar challenges and issues where there's a lot of organizations and a lot of communities doing really good work, but really similar work, right? And trying to get a sense of, when other organizations or communities have started to develop similar frameworks, what approach did they take, right? Where did they start? What were those common needs that have been identified kind of across the board, right? So we started with that outreach component. There's a handful of folks on this call today who were a part of that outreach, which is greatly appreciated. So we conducted both local and what we're calling regional, so across kind of coastal New England. We spoke to a few of our communities, as well as the Seabrook-Hampton Estuary Alliance, so some community organizations. And then we also spoke, like I said, kind of across the coastal New England area, so down, to Rhode Island, Cape Cod, Nantucket, and we also spoke to Southern Maine Planning and Development, which they actually, I think it was 2019, they started a very similar program, a regional sustainability and resiliency program, sounds familiar, to address very similar challenges, right? So a lot of this really important, great work that's happening, but kind of, there being overlap across the communities, and by taking a regional approach, able to think a little bit more efficiently and act a little bit more effectively. So when we did this outreach and we conducted this, we really asked for kind of a standard set of questions, right? So we wanted to know what the different programs looked like. So, what was the motivation for developing a coastal resilience and sustainability program? What was the program structure, right? So how is it staffed? How many staffers? Are they full-time staff, part-time staff? Are all the puzzle pieces kind of fitting together for the actual operations of the program? And then we asked about funding as well, which Tim is going to touch base on a little bit further in this presentation, but trying to get a general sense of, other communities or other, planning commissions that have started similar programs. How have they been funding them? And then we talked about, what challenges were these programs facing? What research was done prior to creating the program. And very similarly, a lot of folks mentioned they did sort of a similar outreach exercise, right? We're looking at existing programs across New England and across the country. And then we asked about some other or some existing or current projects that were ongoing and, trying to figure out sort of what that looked like and what the actual, effectiveness of their programs were. And we identified a handful of sort of common themes across the outreach. So we identified the value of community engagement and education. So that's not only just with municipalities and municipal staff and boards and committees, but that's also kind of public community engagement and education, broadly across our municipalities. The value for regional coordination. So really what that is, boils down to is kind of the sharing of information across municipal boundaries, right? So if one community is working on a very similar project that another community is hoping to get off the ground, we should be having discussions about, what worked in that first community and what were the challenges. And that way we can sort of, be a lot more effective right off the bat, rather than sort of, duplicating efforts that might have already been done in a neighboring community or within the region. Another value that was discussed was really connecting communities to resources. So that was, specifically technical assistance and funding, right? So kind of, we'll talk about it a little further in the presentation, but sort of that matchmaking piece of, a community has a project that they want to implement, but, how do we fund it, right? Are there grants that maybe a municipal committee or board isn't necessarily aware of? And what role could this program play in sort of making those connections to be able to actually make those projects implementable? And then providing sort of this baseline regional assessment, right? And that's about identifying priorities. So each community likely has sort of some sort of sense of this, the priorities within their individual municipal boundaries, but what does that look like on a regional scale? And then lastly, a common theme that was really throughout a lot of the programs that we spoke to was really making sure that whatever framework or program we develop is dynamic and adaptive. So that means that it might change, these needs might change based off of science that, new science and data that's coming out every year, or it might change based off of, COVID-19 was a factor that a lot of folks talked about, of needing to sort of shift their plans for what they had anticipated that the program looked like over the course of 2020 and 2021, and making sure that whatever we create has that ability to be flexible. So from that outreach, we drafted the document that was distributed to all of you, which is sort of the framework, right? The mission that we established in that framework was really to foster more sustainable and resilient communities in New Hampshire by leveraging regional collaboration, regional capacity, and funding, and enhancing the effectiveness of local government, sustainability, and resilience actions. So that sort of encompasses all of those common themes that we identified from our outreach. And then we further broke it down into sort of these three, program pillars or program goals. So regional coordination being key, community engagement and education. Like I said, not just among our municipal, staff and boards and committees, but the broader community. And then technical assistance, which really brings in sort of that planning and grant funding piece of the puzzle. So I'm going to try to keep this relatively brief, but I do just want to sort of break down those three goals a little bit before we dive into the potential funding mechanisms. So regional coordination, when we're talking about that, the goal is really to create a collaborative network to share knowledge and coordination efforts on sustainability and resiliency across the region. How that would be done. So, this program, this framework through the RPC would serve as that primary point of contact for sustainability and resiliency efforts across the region. So making sure that we're aware of sort of everything that's going on, and that way we can help to facilitate, track, and share that information across the region. And that includes, not only sharing sort of what efforts are going on, but also what projects have been successful, and starting to recognize if there are duplication of efforts, we can start to recognize those and maybe sort of stop them in their tracks before there is, two different projects that are doing very similar things happening at once. And then another big piece of this is, there's a lot of community climate action groups already existing in this region. And we don't necessarily need to recreate the wheel, but making sure that this, the staffing that's part of this program is really clued into all of the things that those groups are doing, right? All of the efforts, and making sure that, if at CAW they're talking about something and then it, comes up at a SHE meeting, it's important to make sure that we're having those connections so that we really try to be efficient and effective. And, within the document, I have a slide for each of these that lists out objectives, but I'm not going to read through them all, but they are outlined in that document that we sent ahead of the meeting. And there's, a goal for each of these program goals, and then there's objectives and specific actions that are listed further in the document that sort of detail out what this might look like. And the next piece is community engagement and education. So that's the second goal. When we're talking about this, it really is to try to broaden public understanding of regional sustainability and resiliency while providing educational opportunities to expand municipal and community participation. So similarly to regional coordination, but kind of taking it a step farther to start to identify those priority projects or new projects, across the municipalities, and then also to build on ongoing efforts. The regional coordination piece, we would be taking in all of the information of sort of what's going on in all of our municipalities and all of those climate action groups. And then we would create some sort of platform, whether it's online or a monthly newsletter, email, or something like that, where we would then distribute all of that information to our member communities to make sure that, not only do we know what's going on, but that all of our member communities who are involved in this program also know what's going on a consistent basis. Or there's one kind of platform where you can go to find out that information. And then, as I mentioned, serving as a resource for that information, but also as a resource for available funding opportunities to assist municipalities in actually, getting funds to implement those projects that we've started to identify. And then the last piece of this is providing high-level trainings and general education, not only on how to access funding, but also maybe how to approach planning for sustainability and resiliency, and then also how to prioritize projects and long-term goals. So oftentimes, you might have in a community a handful of projects, and you're not really sure which ones, makes sense to go first, or which one makes sense to, kind of be the last one on the list. So making sure that we can provide that context of sort of how to prioritize when we're looking at it, not only at a municipal level, but also at a regional level. And as I mentioned, each one of these has kind of that goal, objective, and then action items as well that expand specifically onto what it would look like in practice and how we would do those things. And then the last piece is that technical assistance. So this is really where we get into sort of the planning assistance, right? So this is talking about, assisting with drafting and development of funding applications. So, actually helping a committee or a board who's interested in applying for a funding opportunity, how do they go about applying for that grant? And this program would be a resource for that. Similarly, assisting with drafting and development of planning documents. So that could be, a sustainability chapter in the master plan, or, a natural resources chapter, things of that nature. And following suit, similarly, assistance with updating and drafting of applicable land use regulations, which when we get to the discussion point, Jen can probably give us a little bit of background on what's happening in the land use regulation side of things with some of this work. And then lastly, really making sure that we have that implementation piece. So, if there are shovel-ready projects or projects that a community has already prioritized and has, ready to go, making sure that this program is a resource to actually, get those to the implementation phase. So as I mentioned, the goal with that technical assistance piece is to provide communities with the support necessary to incorporate these sustainability and resiliency efforts into community operations, culture, planning, and decision-making, focusing on the implementation of objectives and strategies to reach those regional and local goals. And next, I'll hand it back to Tim to give a brief overview on sort of some of the funding options, and then we'll go into a discussion piece. So if you guys have started to think about questions. Tim, you're muted.
There we go. Thanks, Sarah. I appreciate that. So I think some of the key things that lead into the question of funding are some of the points that Sarah was making that make this maybe a little different than some past efforts. And that is, the idea here is to get somebody on the ground that has municipal knowledge, planning knowledge, to help implement a lot of the good work that's being done. There's a lot of work that's been done already, and there's a lot of groups talking about the work that's done. But actually getting somebody on the ground that can go through the vulnerability analysis, the hazard mitigation plan, make sure that those plans don't sit on the shelves with good ideas that don't get moved forward, and bring those ideas forward again and make sure that those plans are top of mind, I guess is the best way to put it. So that's where, we talk about this as a sort of a regional program sort of within the RPC or within RPC and SRPC combined in some way. And that's why we talk about having some funding mechanisms. And, the conversation started with the coastal program. Originally, it was just myself and Natalie and Kirsten. I think that probably talked about this the most. And, the reason we're here today is they thought it'd be worth looking into this at a regional level through the Innovative Land Use Guide project that we currently have that's sort of funding this framework discussion. So, we certainly would look to use some federal state money. As I mentioned in my earlier remarks, the DOT is very much moving forward in the arena of coastal resilience and paying a lot of attention now to, the infrastructure on the coastline. The Newcastle Causeway studies just completed. The corridor, the STCDA, the corridor vulnerability analysis that RPC has done is feeding into a lot of the DOT work. So they would be a potential area where we could, access some funding to support a position to sort of run this program. I mentioned the coastal program already as an option. FEMA, Homeland Security also is an option that could be out there. Private foundations are another area that we would be interested in pursuing and looking into. We've got some irons in the fire now that I can't talk about yet, but we're looking into some opportunities there. And in the RPC itself is in the hopefully final stretch of establishing the Rockingham Planning Foundation, which is a 501c3, which would then provide or allow access to funding, which isn't always available to government entities. So we could pursue some of that private foundation funding directly to help offset any costs of this program and keep that off the backs of the communities. And then of course, there's still local funding. Some thoughts on that might be, communities pay membership to the RPC. If we worked from that model and said, let's let's add in a coastal resilience service. Could be sort of like I call it the cable TV model, where you sort of buy the sports package, right? And so you'd add on to local dues potentially to support your participation in this program. The other idea might be some of the funding opportunity that's already enabled under RSA 3653. There's some enabling legislation. I think that was proposed by Senator Waters a couple of years ago and passed, that allows communities to establish coastal resiliency funds with the purpose of addressing sea level rise impacts, storm surge, flooding. It specifically calls out working with the Rockingham Planning Commission or Stratford Regional Planning Commission to enter into cooperative agreements to address, current and future impacts of, related to coastal resilience and sea level rise. So there's options out there. We hadn't included this yet in the document that we sent out because we wanted to have this conversation first and at least present some of these ideas to you that we're thinking about. So if Sarah, you want to hit the next slide? So with that sort of laying the groundwork for the funding, I guess one of the first couple of questions that we wanted to ask, and then we'll just open it up for discussion and comments, was to, what's the interest in the program? Is there anything that we haven't addressed in what you've read and heard so far? And do you see any value? What do you see as members of the community and members of the region? Let's see any.
Valerie?
Well, I know in Northampton, we just recently completed our first master plan chapter in coastal resiliency, and being such a small place, I think we have to think about how are we going to implement all the great ideas that we have in there, the goals and objectives. So I think this sort of thing would be helpful to us, just like the way Jen Rowden is, when we hire her as a circuit rider, because we're small and we don't have staff like some of these other communities. I can see that how it would help us, keep get going and keep going on something brand new that we've just developed. So I'm speaking for myself. I haven't talked to the rest of the planning board, but I would see how this would really be good timing for us.
Excellent. I saw Ravi's hand go up and then Kristen's.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. My thinking coming from Seabrook is sort of like what Valerie said from Northampton. It absolutely makes sense to do this. And I guess what I'm gathering from the presentation is that to have a program office for the overall coastal resiliency and sustainability in with the RPC to coordinate across the multiple communities makes complete sense, because I don't believe that anything to do with the climate on coast can be done piecemeal, because the problems that they span across the boundaries of the municipalities and towns. So it's got to be done minimally at a regional level. So it makes a lot of sense to take this approach. I would like to know more about the details of how something like this would be stood up. Where would the seed funding be available for it? or come from, and how would this program office be sustained? You know, I would be more interested in knowing how those will be done, because I can see that once there is a program office for this, it can certainly help with the development of the appropriate portions of the master plans of the various communities, but they can all be coordinated so that the time frame for any mitigation that's going to be implemented or done in such a way that it will actually be effective across all the affected communities. So makes complete sense to me. It's just a matter of the details and the logistics of getting an office like this stood up.
I appreciate those comments, then. Kristen.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I agree. I kind of benefited from some, and maybe would benefit from more discussion on how, you know, how this organization would collaborate and coordinate and not duplicate efforts like CAW and others. One area that I do feel we are really lacking in terms of sustainability is, or resilience even, is sort of the inland resilience efforts. And so we have a lot of support for, we have a lot of organizations that help provide support for coastal resilience, but things like flooding under climate change scenarios outside of the coastal zone, those models are really far delayed from what we have on the coast. And so I would love to see, you know, an expansion into sustainability to include things like, you know, maybe inland flooding models, heat island modeling, and things like that. I feel like those are some pretty big data gaps. And that, in my mind, would also be a more natural bridge to those inland communities that are not just coastal, that fall within RPC and SRPC's, you know, regions.
Yeah, we, you know, I think Natalie mentioned in the chat, there's some similarities to the goals of CAW, and that's, yeah, it's hard to not overlap a little bit with given CAW's scope and what they do. But I guess the thing I'm trying to differentiate is that I'm trying to sort of assign a planner to get on the ground and get into the communities and start working directly. I think CAW does a great job advancing the conversations and would be an important component of anything that was happening with us. But I want to make sure that somebody's there for you all as communities in the RPC. So I'm going to go to, Ravi, I think your hand's still up. I'm going to go to Peter and then Natalie.
Thanks. Yeah, I just want to echo a little bit of what people have said. I think for me that the reasons I think this sounds like a beneficial program is, well, just focusing on coastal resilience at all is important for everyone to do. So the more, the better, I think. But in terms of the outreach to local communities, I think that idea that you could be staff support to communities that might not come to CAW or might not go put in grant applications to the coastal program that don't have as much staff. I think that's another benefit, that you can go show people what's out there. I really like the idea of a sort of a standardized approach to a master plan chapter, or so we're all at least aware of the same kind of planning documents throughout the region. That to me is another big benefit. And then, you know, to the extent that you can bring more funding and get more funding to communities, obviously we're all going to be eager to get that and get things moving. So I too want to hear more about it and see where it comes out. But you know, I like the idea.
Natalie.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. First of all, I think it's really exciting to me to see so many local faces on the call today. So thank you all for being here. It's just really nice to be having this conversation at a more regional level. I think when I think about the gaps that exist and the need for this sort of a regional program, what it really comes down to me is capacity. And I think I was really glad to hear Valerie and others echo the need for like this type of a circuit rider resilience planner. And I think, you know, that model has worked really well for land use planning, generally speaking. And I think, you know, could easily be applied to the coastal resiliency and, you know, inland resiliency landscape. And I think that like the technical assistance piece and staffing is really like, should be the foundation of this program, because once we get, you know, additional staff on board and into communities, we're going to be doing a better job at regional coordination. Right now, not every coastal zone community is represented on the coastal adaptation work group. And I think that's, you know, that doesn't enable us to do our job as well as we could be. And so I think by having these circuit rider planners from RPC participating on the ground and providing services to communities directly, we would have added capacity for them to also participate in CA and to also start driving kind of these regional conversations. So I think for me, the fundamental need is people and man and women power. So whatever we can do to get additional staff into the RPC and out into the communities, I think will like bring us a long way from where we are.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that is really the differentiation for this idea of a program. It's, you know, we don't need another group talking about this. I need to get somebody into Northampton or elsewhere. You know, and it'll likely, if we can get this going, it'll start small. It might be one person running around to a bunch of different communities for now, but it's, you know, I think we can prove the effectiveness out if we can just get the seed money and get this project rolling. So thanks for the comments. Anyone else? Oh, go ahead, Kim.
So Tim, you had talked about the funding, that you were going to make it like a cable channel, additional network fee-based. So if the RPC was to have a staff circuit rider, I don't know if, I mean, our select board in our town is very cheap. I don't know if RI would pay the extra fees to RPC. They'd say, what's the value add? What are they doing now? And why do we have to pay extra for this? So could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that's just one concept of multiple ideas that aren't fully fleshed out yet, Kim. So there's also private foundation grants, pursuing grant funding that way, pursuing funding through the standard federal state channels that we have. You know, but as you know, in New Hampshire, there's limited amounts of funding to go around. So yeah, I think we'd have to be able to demonstrate the value and the reason why to get communities on board. It's the never-ending struggle for regional planning in New Hampshire. So yeah, but that is just, think of that as just one potential component, but not necessarily the primary funder. And I guess the only other thing I might add to that is, you know, if we were able to get this going and like it is now, I mean, when the communities buy into an RPC, when they're here and they're members, you sort of have to think of it, and I need the select boards to think of it a little differently, that you're here as a collaborative to coordinate, and you're sharing a resource, and, you know, we pool those resources to try and make sure that, you know, the rising tide, right, takes up all the boats. We're not going to leave, you know, where's Dennis Hebert? I'm not going to leave Newington out because they're the smallest community and pay the least amount of dues. We try to bring them along as well. And so that's one of the challenges, but it's definitely one we're going to have to face. The other thing I wanted to mention too is that Stratford is here. Kyle and Jen Sis are both here, and I think Autumn's here too. And we didn't do this necessarily with blinders that it would just be RPC, because the coastal zone extends up into the Stratford region. So that's another area that we haven't quite figured out how we would maybe coordinate this. if it were to move forward, but it's something we need to talk about a little bit more. Any other questions, comments, thoughts? Natalie again.
Yeah, I just, on the funding piece, I think it definitely is probably gonna have to take, a lot of different pots of money. And certainly I would say grant funding is probably not the most sustainable funding for establishing and sustaining this type of a program long-term, to Ravi's earlier point. And so the coastal program currently has a NOAA grant project, which both RPC and SRPC are involved with. And one of the pieces of that kind of multifaceted project is to facilitate a partnership conversation between the coastal program, the regional planning commissions, Homeland Security, Emergency Management, Office of Planning and Development, and FEMA Region 1. And one of the things that I really hope to explore as part of that partnership discussion is, whether or not these other state agencies that work on hazard mitigation and floodplain management may have resources that we could start to pool and combine with the coastal programs dollars. For example, Homeland Security and Emergency Management gets a lot of money from the federal government. And how can we maybe start taking advantage of those in a more productive way, perhaps by staffing, these regional kind of circuit rider positions. So I think, that's something, Tim, that we should maybe put our heads together about and think whether or not, there's a way that we can entice them to share the resources that they get for this purpose, because they too are lacking capacity. So, if they have the funding, maybe you can bring in the people, and then we all kind of move towards our shared goals and priorities together. So that's another thought.
It's a good thought. And it just reminds me, I can't say any details, but there's energy groups out there that are interested in sustainability and climate and resilience. And we're in conversations with at least one of them right now that could help support this program. And to both Ravi and Kim's points, the challenges of local funding, I think it's interesting that the communities in Maine that kicked this off with the Southern Maine Planning Group, it was local funding. They came together and went to the Regional Planning Commission in Southern Maine and said, we want to do this, which is just a completely different world, I guess, even though you cross the Piscataqua River and it's like a completely different funding mechanism. But it's all, you're right now, it's all going to have to be brought together, and there's going to be a lot of little pieces, whether or not every community participates or not. Any other thoughts, questions?
Yeah, one quick point here. Sitting on the Board of Selectmen here in Seabrook, one of the things that I see is that we have had groups come to ask us to support them in getting access to the various other boards in the town, like the planning board, the zoning board, and so forth, to work with them on more coastal resiliency related things. So different groups come and ask, and the difficulty has been on one hand, that we certainly want to support it. On the other hand, there are lots of little ad hoc, disconnected or disjointed efforts that come in and ask for things like this. And one of the biggest value propositions for an office on this coastal resiliency and sustainability in RPC might be to reduce that kind of demands for access and reach into people for input by being more coordinated, because the advantage in doing this across multiple communities might be that that many times not all questions need to be answered by all communities, but some communities providing answers to some questions may be extended, to apply to other communities. So the overall burden of having to go back and engage and get information, which always seems to be somewhat painful because people need to come up with volunteers and so forth, which is not easy to do. If that is reduced, or if that is seen as something that this office can help reduce, that could be viewed very advantageously by the different communities. So I just wanted to share that.
Valerie.
This is just, a small thing, I suppose, but it's an example of how this kind of operation coordination, knowing what's going on in the communities could be helpful. I'm on the Little Boar's Head Garden Club, and someone knows my interest in all these topics, and they have a need, and this is something that, maybe can be dealt with as various parties are dealing with the transportation issues. Route 1 right there at Northampton Beach State Park, is they have 2 little gardens, and it's the only green space, and it's quite nice, and it's been there forever, and by the fish houses, which is historic, and you want to take good care of things. One of those is constantly getting pummeled by water and large rocks, and they can't keep much alive there. And so they're interested in knowing potential funding sources to help protect the part of the wall that's, just not keeping things back. I mean, this is a larger issue. That water drops rocks on the garden and puts it on Route 1. But this is something that if there was work being done on Route 1, which I imagine there will be at some point, whoever's funding it, if you know that this little local community has this, highly regarded, decades long little garden that just needs a little extra money thrown in there to protect it. It's just an example. On our own, we're not going to get big bucks or a lot of interest, but by maybe feeding into something else, just another reason why this kind of effort can offer payoffs, little and big.
Anyone else? So I guess if there's not, I guess we got to sort of talk just very quickly about next steps, as they mentioned, we're doing this initiative under our current grant with the coastal program, the Innovative Land Use Guide work. What we need to do is take this information that we've heard from you all, sort of incorporate that into the framework as part of our report out to the coastal program and completing that, and then add in a little bit more about the funding. I guess the one thing I've heard I think I have sort of mixed feelings about, mostly communities interested in participating, thinking it's a good idea, local funding being the challenge. But it seems that, that's the summary here, and we need to add in some additional information about the details of how this might be funded. And I think, Natalie, we may have to have a conversation as we wrap this up in the next week or two to figure out how, some of the thoughts that you shared with tying it into the Flood Smart Seacoast project a little bit. So, but that would be the next step, would be to get the framework wrapped up, incorporate this input, and then, continue the conversation after the grant period ends to see what we can do about moving this forward. There's nothing else. That's all I got.
And
One suggestion, if you don't mind, sorry to interrupt.
No, that's okay.
Is that I think that we are not a political organization, but this is a political season. So I was wondering how this issue is important. I wonder how much the candidates think about these things, and how much do they think about helping this sort of effort if they were to be elected. And let me stop there. So.
Yeah, I'm not touching that one, Ravi. No, it always influences, funding in the long run. It's for sure. So we will see what happens in the coming months. Jen, you had something?
Yeah, just a quick wrap up of sort of our next steps with our framework and this project overall. The grant funding that we're using to help put this on ends at the end of June. But our intention is to take what we've heard from today's conversation, sort of put it into a summarized form, make final edits to our framework that we've put together. But we will be following up with everybody who is both on this call, but also the group that we sent out invitations to participate in this conversation. So they'll see the next step, even if they weren't able to be here this afternoon. And we will be following up with that probably in the next week or two as we wrap up this project. So that you'll be hearing from us again, whether you want to or not. But thank you all for being here. It's really great to see this many towns participating.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks,
guys.
everyone. Have a good weekend.
Have a
Okay,
great weekend,
bye-bye.
everybody.
Good job, Sarah. Bye-bye.